silken togas, marble columns, and lice. While Roman villas might look luxurious in movies, slipping into bed in ancient Rome often meant sharing it with biting bugs, filthy mattresses, and even sneaky thieves in the night. Tonight, we'll lie back carefully on drift through the lesser-known horrors of Roman bedtime, where danger didn't always come from swords, but from the sheets themselves. If you're ready to squirm just a little before you snooze, tap that bell and subscribe. Our historical bedtime tales are just getting started. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always a joy to see how far our sleepy stories wander. You settle into your Roman bed just as the sun disappears behind the 7 hills of the eternal city. The wooden frame creaks softly under your weight, and you pull the rough woolen blanket up to your chin. But beneath you, in the darkness under your sleeping platform, an entire ecosystem of creatures stirs to life. Welcome to the reality of Roman sleepwear. Rest came with a price measured not just in comfort, but in the constant battle against the tiny invaders that made their homes alongside human inhabitants. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii tells us a story that most Romans would have recognized all too well. When excavators carefully sifted through the volcanic ash at Civita Juliana, they discovered 3 slave beds that had been preserved for nearly 2,000 years. These beds, constructed from wooden posts strung with thin rope arranged like netting, lacked conventional mattresses and were instead covered with loose blankets. But it was what they found underneath these beds that revealed the true nature of Roman sleeping arrangements. Storage jars beneath the beds contained the skeletal remains of mice that had been living under them, creating a permanent rodent community directly beneath where humans slept each night. These mice weren't occasional visitors, they were permanent residents of Roman bedrooms. The design of Roman beds, particularly those of the lower classes, created perfect conditions for rodent habitation. The raised sleeping platforms provided shelter from the elements and protection from larger predators, while the storage areas beneath offered easy access to food scraps and nesting materials. The rope netting construction, while practical for its time, left gaps that allowed easy movement for small creatures. The loose blankets above provided warmth that attracted cold-blooded insects and other vermin. Seeking a cozy environment, Roman beds came in many varieties, each with its own particular vulnerability to infestation. The lectus cubicularis, designed specifically for sleeping, was typically constructed with a wooden frame, crossed leather or fabric straps for support, and mattresses stuffed with wool, swan feathers, or straw. While wealthy Romans enjoyed beds made from exotic precious woods polished to shine like peacock feathers called lecti pavanine, decorated with bronze inlays, mother of pearl, and glass paste, even these luxurious sleeping arrangements weren't immune to unwanted guests. The organic materials used in mattress construction, wool, feathers, and especially straw, provided ideal food sources for clothes, moths, carpet beetles, and other fabric-destroying insects. The simplest Roman beds presented even greater challenges. In the poorest homes, beds were nothing more than rectangular blocks made of terracotta or fired clay, topped with thin mattresses stuffed with dried vegetables or leaves. These primitive sleeping surfaces sat directly on the floor, creating immediate contact between the sleeper and ground-dwelling insects, spiders, and other arthropods. The rough surfaces of these clay beds provided countless tiny crevices where bedbugs could hide during the day, emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. The Roman understanding of these pest problems was surprisingly sophisticated for their time. They recognized that certain materials attracted unwanted creatures and developed various strategies to combat infestations. Roman households regularly fumigated their homes by burning sulfur, filling rooms with acrid smoke in an attempt to drive out bedbugs and other pests. This process was both unpleasant and dangerous, as the sulfur dioxide produced could cause respiratory problems. but it represented one of the few effective methods available for pest control in the ancient world. Archaeological evidence from Herculaneum provides additional insight into Roman pest control strategies. Excavators discovered mattresses stuffed with leaves rather than the more common straw or wool, suggesting that Romans understood certain plants had antiparasitic properties. This wasn't mere folk wisdom. Many aromatic plants do indeed repel insects, and the Romans were experimenting with natural pest deterrents centuries before modern chemistry provided synthetic alternatives. But the battle against bedroom vermin extended beyond individual households. The very design of Roman domestic architecture created conditions that favored pest populations. The cubicular Roman bedrooms were typically small, windowless rooms that opened onto the atrium or peristome. These dark spaces, illuminated only by flickering oil lamps, provided exactly the kind of environment that many pests preferred. The lack of natural light meant that infestations could develop unnoticed for extended periods, while the limited ventilation allowed humidity to build up, creating conditions favorable for mold growth and the insects that fed on it. The Romans also had to contend with seasonal variations in pest activity. Summer brought increased insect activity as warmer temperatures accelerated breeding cycles and made creatures more aggressive in their search for food and water. Winter presented different challenges, as various pests sought warm shelter in bedding and mattresses, turning Roman beds into inadvertent hibernation sites for beetles, moths, and other creatures. What made Roman beds particularly vulnerable was the organic nature of virtually all construction materials. Unlike modern synthetic fabrics and foam mattresses, every component of a Roman bed provided potential food for some type of pest. The wooden frames could be attacked by various boring insects and termites. The rope or leather suspension systems attracted creatures that fed on animal products. The wool, feather, or straw stuffing in mattresses provided both food and nesting material for numerous species. Even the animal skins used as blankets could harbor parasites and attract scavenging insects. The social implications of pest infestation were significant in Roman society. A household's ability to maintain clean, pest-free sleeping areas was often seen as a reflection of the homeowner's competence and social status. Wealthy Romans invested considerable resources in pest control, employing slaves specifically tasked with cleaning and maintaining bedrooms. While poor families had to endure infestations they couldn't afford to address effectively. Yet, despite all these challenges, Romans continued to share their beds with an invisible ecosystem of creatures that had adapted to life alongside human inhabitants. As you lay on your Roman bed tonight, feeling the rope netting sag slightly under your weight and hearing the faint scurrying sounds from the shadows below, you might wonder, what other secrets did these ancient sleeping arrangements conceal? And how did Romans manage to get any rest at all with so many uninvited guests sharing their most intimate spaces? The morning light filtering through the small window of your Roman cubiculum reveals evidence of the nocturnal battles you've been fighting without realizing it. Tiny dark spots on your woolen blanket tell the story of bedbugs that fed on your blood while you slept. And you notice fresh holes in the fabric where hungry moth larvae have been steadily consuming the fibers. This is the reality that every Roman faced. Sleep wasn't a peaceful respite from the day's labors, but rather an 8-hour vulnerability to creatures that had evolved specifically to exploit resting humans. Roman beds were crawling with dangers that modern sleepers can barely imagine. The bedbug, known to Romans as Cimex, had already established a global empire by the time Rome reached its peak. These parasitic insects had perfected the art of living alongside human populations, hiding in the crevices of wooden bed frames during the day and emerging at night to feed on sleeping victims. What made Roman beds particularly attractive to bedbugs was their construction, the gaps in rope netting. The joints were wooden pieces connected, and the rough surfaces of clay and terracotta beds all provided perfect hiding spots for these persistent parasites. The life cycle of bedbugs in Roman households created a perpetual infestation cycle that was nearly impossible to break. Female bedbugs could lay up to 5 eggs per day in tiny cracks and crevices around sleeping areas. These eggs, barely visible to the naked eye, hatched within 6 to 10 days, producing juvenile bugs that immediately sought blood meals from sleeping humans. The warm, dark environment under Roman beds, combined with regular access to food in the form of sleeping occupants, created ideal conditions for rapid population growth. Roman attempts to combat bedbugs revealed both the sophistication and limitations of ancient pest control knowledge. The sulfur fumigation method, while effective in the short term, required evacuating the entire household and could only be performed periodically due to the toxic nature of the smoke. Wealthy Romans might hire professional fumigators who specialized in these procedures, but the process was expensive, time-consuming, and only temporarily effective. Bedbugs could return within weeks of treatment, having survived in small numbers and overlooked hiding places or migrating from neighboring buildings. The Roman military faced particularly severe bedbug problems during campaigns. Soldiers sleeping in temporary accommodations or crowded barracks provided ideal conditions for rapid spread of infestations between units. The close quarters and frequent movement of troops meant that a single infested individual could spread bedbugs throughout an entire legion. Military records suggest that pest infestations sometimes affected combat effectiveness as sleep-deprived. Soldiers struggled to maintain peak performance on little rest. But bedbugs were just one component of the complex ecosystem that inhabited Roman sleeping areas. Clothes, moths posed an equally significant threat, though their damage was economic rather than physical. Roman textiles represented major investments. Wool, clothing, blankets, and bed linens could cost months of wages for ordinary citizens. Clothes moths, particularly the larvae stage, fed voraciously on natural fibers including wool, fur, feathers, and animal hides. A single infestation could destroy an entire household's textile wealth in a matter of months. The Roman approach to moth prevention demonstrated practical understanding of pest behavior. Wealthy households stored valuable textiles in wooden chests with tight-fitting lids, sometimes adding aromatic herbs like lavender or cedar that naturally repelled moths. These storage methods, while effective, meant that bedding and clothing had to be aired regularly to prevent them from acquiring musty odors from prolonged storage in sealed containers. Roman beds also harbored a variety of other arthropods that found the sleeping environment hospitable. Carpet beetles, relatives of the more familiar clothes. Moths fed on similar materials, but were even more destructive because they consumed not just natural fibers, but also shed human skin, hair, and other organic debris that accumulated in bedding. These beetles could survive on the microscopic particles of dead skin that humans naturally shed during sleep, making them nearly impossible to eliminate entirely. Spiders were both beneficial and problematic inhabitants of Roman bedrooms. While they helped control populations of flying insects and smaller pests, larger species could pose direct threats to sleepers. Roman houses frequently harbored wolf spiders, which were aggressive nocturnal hunters that might bite humans who inadvertently disturbed them during sleep. The dark, undisturbed spaces beneath beds provided ideal hunting grounds for these predators, who emerged at night to patrol for prey. The seasonal nature of pest problems meant that Romans faced different challenges throughout the year. Spring brought renewed activity from overwintering insects. As warming temperatures triggered mating cycles and increased feeding behavior, summer represented peak pest season with maximum reproductive activity and aggressive feeding. Autumn saw many species seeking sheltered overwintering sites, often in the warm, protected environment of bedding and mattresses. Even winter brought its own problems as desperate pests concentrated in the warmest available spaces, often leading to dense concentrations of insects in sleeping areas. Roman medical knowledge recognized the health implications of pest infestations, though their understanding of disease transmission was limited by contemporary scientific knowledge. They observed that households with severe pest problems often experienced higher rates of illness, particularly skin conditions and fevers, but couldn't make the connection between insect vectors and disease spread that modern medicine takes for granted. The economic impact of bedroom pests extended beyond simple property damage. Roman households devoted significant resources to pest control, purchasing sulfur for fumigation, replacing damaged textiles, paying for professional cleaning services, and investing in pest-resistant storage solutions. For many families, the cost of maintaining pest-free sleeping areas represented a major household expense that competed with other essential needs. The social dimensions of pest control created additional pressures for Roman families. A household's reputation could suffer if guests encountered severe infestations during visits, potentially affecting business relationships and social standing. This pressure was particularly intense for families involved in hospitality industries, who needed to maintain pest-free accommodations to attract and retain customers. Roman slaves faced the most severe consequences of pest infestations, as they typically slept in the most basic accommodations with minimal pest control resources. The Civita Juliana discovery shows slave beds with permanent rodent populations, suggesting that household staff simply accepted sharing their sleeping spaces with various creatures as an unavoidable reality of their circumstances. Yet despite all these challenges, Romans developed remarkable resilience to pest problems. They learned to sleep through minor disturbances from insects and small creatures, developing tolerance for discomfort that modern sleepers would find intolerable. This adaptation was born of necessity in a world where perfect pest control was impossible. Humans had to coexist with the creatures that shared their sleeping spaces. As another Roman night falls and you prepare to climb into your wooden-framed bed, you might pause to consider the invisible army of creatures preparing for their own nocturnal activities. The mice stirring in the storage jars beneath your sleeping platform, the bed bugs emerging from cracks in the wooden frame, the moths fluttering toward your oil lamp, part of an ancient ecosystem that viewed human bedrooms not as private sanctuaries, but as shared habitats where every species struggled for survival. What remains to be explored is how the very architecture meant to protect Roman sleepers often became their greatest enemy. How did the buildings designed to shelter families become deadly traps that claimed more lives than enemy armies? The scratching sounds beneath your Roman bed have grown more persistent as the night deepens. But now you notice something far more troubling, a faint vibration through the wooden frame that suggests movement much larger than mice. Your bed rests on the third floor of an insulae, and the building itself has begun to settle and shift with the weight of its 7 stories and hundreds of residents. The creatures living in your mattress and under your sleeping platform represent only the most visible part of a larger ecosystem of dangers that permeated Roman domestic life. Dangers that often proved fatal, not because of their immediate threat, but because of the cumulative effect of thousands of tiny compromises to health, safety, and structural integrity. The discovery at Civita Juliana revealed more than just mouse skeletons. Beneath Roman beds it exposed an entire underground economy of creatures that had learned to exploit human sleeping habits. The storage jars found beneath the slave beds contained not just mouse remains, but also evidence of rats, various insects, and even small snake skeletons. These weren't random intrusions, but established populations that had lived for generations in the spaces Roman humans considered their most private and secure. The rat population beneath Roman beds represented a particular danger that most inhabitants never fully appreciated. Unlike mice, which primarily threatened stored food and textiles, rats carried diseases that could devastate entire households. The close proximity of rat nests to sleeping humans created ideal conditions for disease Transmission, as parasites like fleas could easily move between rat hosts and human victims. The bubonic plague, while not reaching pandemic levels in Roman times, occasionally appeared in Roman cities, often spreading through exactly these kinds of human-rodent interactions in crowded, residential areas. Roman beds also harbored more exotic dangers that reflected the empire's vast trading networks. Imported textiles and exotic woods used in luxury bed construction sometimes carried non-native species of insects and parasites that had no natural predators in the Mediterranean environment. These introduced species could establish explosive populations in Roman bedrooms, creating infestations of unprecedented severity that traditional Roman pest control methods couldn't handle effectively. The wooden construction of most Roman beds made them susceptible to a range of wood-boring insects that could compromise structural integrity over time. Powder post beetles, furniture beetles, and various species of termites all found Roman furniture attractive targets. While a few beetle holes might seem like minor cosmetic damage, extensive infestation could weaken bed frames to the point of collapse, sometimes with serious consequences for sleepers. Roman medical records include numerous references to injuries caused by bed collapses, though they rarely identified insect damage as the underlying cause. The organic materials used in roaming mattresses created complex microenvironments that supported diverse populations of microscopic organisms. Wool mattresses, in particular, could develop extensive mold colonies in humid conditions, producing spores that caused respiratory problems for sleepers. The symptoms of what we now recognize as mold-related illness were often attributed to other causes by Roman physicians, who lacked the tools to identify fungal contamination as a health threat. Roman attempts to address these problems through design modifications often created new vulnerabilities. Some wealthy households experimented with metal bed frames made from bronze or iron, thinking these would be immune to insect damage. However, metal beds presented their own challenges. They conducted cold more efficiently than wood, making them uncomfortable in winter, and the joints where metal pieces connected still provided hiding places for bed bugs and other small pests. The seasonal migration patterns of various creatures meant that Roman beds experienced constant changes in their invisible populations. Spring brought an influx of newly active insects emerging from winter dormancy, often in numbers that overwhelmed existing populations of beneficial predators like spiders. Summer saw peak activity levels for most pest species, with aggressive feeding and rapid reproduction cycles. Autumn brought a different challenge, as various creatures sought protected overwintering sites, often leading to concentrated infestations in bedding materials. Roman military manuals from the later imperial period include specific instructions for inspecting bedding and sleeping areas for pest infestations, suggesting that the problem had become serious enough to affect military effectiveness. Soldiers were trained to recognize signs of bedbug infestations and taught methods for treating contaminated equipment. The mobility of military units made pest control particularly challenging, as infested individuals could spread problems throughout the army with devastating effect on unit cohesion and fighting capability. The economic implications of bedroom pest problems extended far beyond individual households. Roman cities devoted considerable public resources to pest control efforts, including regulations governing the disposal of organic waste that might attract rats and insects to residential areas. Public officials responsible for urban sanitation had to balance the need for effective pest control against the practical limitations of available technology and resources. Professional pest control services emerged as a specialized industry in major Roman cities, with experts who understood the behavior patterns of different species and could design targeted interventions. These specialists commanded high fees for their services, making effective pest control a luxury that only wealthy households could afford regularly. The resulting disparity meant that pest problems were often concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods, where they could reach epidemic proportions before spreading to more affluent areas. Roman medical texts describe a range of ailments that we now recognize as pest-related, though contemporary physicians rarely made the connection. Sleep disorders attributed to supernatural causes were often actually the result of chronic bed bug infestations. Skin conditions blamed on imbalanced humors frequently resulted from exposure to various parasites and allergens present in contaminated bedding. Respiratory problems often traced to mold spores and insect debris in mattresses and sleeping areas. The architectural design of Roman bedrooms inadvertently created optimal conditions for many pest species. The small, poorly ventilated cubicula retained humidity and organic odors that attracted various insects. The common practice of storing food, clothing, and other organic materials in the same room as sleeping areas provided abundant resources. For pest populations, the dark environment, illuminated only by flickering oil lamps, meant that infestations could develop unnoticed until they reached serious levels. The social stigma associated with pest problems created additional health risks as families often concealed infestations rather than seeking help. This denial allowed problems to worsen over time and often led to spread throughout neighborhoods as infected households continued normal social interactions without addressing underlying pest issues. Roman slaves and servants, who typically slept in the most basic accommodations, bore the heaviest burden of pest-related health problems. Their sleeping areas often received no pest control attention whatsoever, leading to severe infestations that affected not just their health, but their ability to perform household duties effectively. The cycle of declining health and reduced work capacity often trapped slaves in deteriorating conditions that became progressively more difficult to escape. The cumulative effect of chronic pest exposure on human health represented a hidden epidemic that Roman society never fully recognized or addressed. The constant stress of sharing sleeping spaces with potentially dangerous creatures, combined with sleep disruption from pest activity, created conditions that weakened immune systems and made individuals more susceptible to other diseases. As you lie awake in your Roman bed, listening to the complex symphony of scratching, scurrying, and buzzing that emanates from the darkness around you, you begin to understand that the real danger isn't any single creature, but rather the entire ecosystem that has evolved to exploit human vulnerability during sleep. The mice under your bed, the bed bugs in your mattress, the moths in your blankets, they're all part of a larger story about how the very act of seeking rest and security created new forms of danger that Romans could never fully escape. But even as you contemplate these invisible threats, a more immediate danger lurks in the flickering flame of the oil lamp that provides your only light against the darkness. How many Roman households discovered that their attempts to illuminate their sleeping spaces created hazards far more deadly than any pest infestation? The wooden stairs creak ominously under your feet as you climb to the 6th floor of your Roman insulae apartment building. Each step upward takes you farther from safety and deeper into a vertical world where the very act of seeking rest becomes a calculated gamble with death. The higher you climb, the more the building sways in the evening wind, subtle but unmistakable reminder that you're ascending into one of the most dangerous architectural experiments in human history. Your tiny bedroom on the upper floor represents not just a place of rest, but a daily confrontation with structural forces that claimed more Roman lives than barbarian invasions. Roman insulae rose from the city streets like primitive skyscrapers, often reaching 7 or 8 stories into the Mediterranean sky. Some exceptional examples exceeded this height before Augustus imposed legal restrictions, making them among the tallest residential structures anywhere in the ancient world. The Lex Iulia Municipalis of 20 BCE attempted to limit building height to 70 Roman Feto, approximately 21 meters, but this regulation came only after decades of catastrophic collapses had demonstrated the deadly consequences of uncontrolled vertical construction. The engineering behind these towering structures revealed a fatal compromise between ambition and safety. Builders constructed the lower levels from brick-faced concrete, providing substantial strength and durability for the foundation floors. But as construction progressed upward, economic pressures forced the use of increasingly lighter and less reliable materials. The upper levels, where the poorest residents lived and slept, were typically constructed from timber and mud brick materials that reduced the weight pressing down on lower floors, but created upper-story bedrooms that were inherently unstable. The social geography of these buildings created a deadly irony. The higher you climbed, the more affordable your rent became, but the greater your risk of dying in your sleep. Ground floors housed expensive tavernet shops and businesses, along with the residences of wealthy tenants who could afford larger rooms, better maintenance, and easy access to street-level exits. The first and second floors attracted middle class Romans who valued the balance between cost and safety. But the upper stories became vertical slums where entire families crowded into single rooms, often without windows, running water, or adequate structural support beneath their sleeping areas. Your sixth-floor cubiculum exemplifies the dangerous conditions that millions of Romans accepted as normal. The single room serves as bedroom, kitchen, storage area, and workshop for your entire household. The ceiling above your sleeping area slopes awkwardly where timber beams have sagged under the weight of floors above. Cracks in the mud brick walls widen and narrow with temperature changes and during storms. You can feel the entire building flex and sway in ways that would terrify modern engineers. The construction techniques used in these upper stories virtually guaranteed structural failure. Over time, Roman builders often used inadequate mortar mixtures with insufficient lime content, compromising the bonds between bricks and stones. Improperly baked bricks dissolved when exposed to water, turning structural walls into crumbling masses that could no longer support the weight above them. The interior cores of walls, which should have consisted of solid, impermeable mortar and aggregate, were frequently nothing more than crude mixtures of rubble and clay that turned to sludge when wet. Archaeological evidence from surviving insulae reveals the shocking reality of Roman residential construction. Excavations have uncovered misaligned floors caused by foundation settling, walls built on unstable bases, and support systems that were inadequate from the moment of construction. The structural defects weren't accidents or results of aging. They were built into these buildings from their earliest days, creating time bombs that could detonate without warning, crushing sleeping families in their beds. The Roman literary record preserves numerous eyewitness accounts of these architectural disasters. Juvenal, the satirical poet, captured the constant terror of insulae living in his third satire, writing of inhabitants bidding the inmates sleep at ease under a roof, ready to tumble about their ears. His words weren't poetic exaggeration, but literal description of nightly reality for millions of Roman citizens who went to bed never certain their building would still be standing at dawn. Alice Gellius provided an even more chilling first-hand account of watching an insulae collapse, describing how he observed a certain insula with many high floors attacked by fire. Everything nearby was already burning in a great conflagration. His testimony reveals how quickly structural failures could cascade. A minor fire or foundation shift could trigger complete building collapse within minutes, trapping hundreds of sleeping residents with no possibility of escape from upper floors. Cicero himself, despite his wealth and political position, couldn't escape the economic realities of insulae ownership. In a letter to his friend Atticus, he complained that 2 of my shops have fallen down and the rest are cracking. So not only the tenants, but the very mice have migrated. His casual mention of structural collapse as a routine business problem illustrates how normalized these disasters had become in Roman urban life. The mouse migration that Cicero mentioned reveals another dimension of the structural danger. Even rodents possessed better survival instincts than human residents. Animals could detect the subtle vibrations and structural stress that preceded major collapses, fleeing buildings before they fell. But human tenants, trapped by economic necessity and lacking alternatives, remained in deteriorating structures long after warning signs had appeared. Strabo, the Roman geographer, observed that the constant cycle of construction and destruction had become a defining characteristic of urban Roman life. He noted the building of houses, which goes on unceasingly in consequence of the collapses and fires and repeated sales. This endless construction cycle created additional dangers, as new buildings were often erected quickly on unstable foundations, left by previous collapses, perpetuating the cycle of structural failure. The seasonal patterns of collapse revealed how environmental factors interacted with poor construction to create deadly conditions. Winter rains saturated the inferior mortars and clay-based construction materials, weakening walls, just as increased heating needs created additional fire hazards. Spring thaws could cause sudden foundation shifts that triggered catastrophic structural failures. Summer heat caused timber beams to expand and contract, loosening joints and creating gaps that compromised structural integrity. The economic incentives that drove insulae construction guaranteed that safety would always be secondary to profit. Maximization. Property developers could maximize rental income by building as high as possible with the cheapest available materials. Since most tenants were too poor to afford better accommodations, they had no choice but to accept dangerous conditions. Landlords faced no meaningful legal liability for tenant deaths caused by structural failures, creating a system where cutting construction costs directly increased owner profits while shifting all risk to renters. The daily reality of living in an upper-story bedroom meant constant awareness of mortality. Every unusual sound: a timber beam groaning under stress, mortar crumbling from walls, neighboring families moving furniture could signal imminent collapse. Sleep became a form of Russian roulette, with each night offering the possibility that you might awaken to find yourself buried under tons of rubble. If you awoke at all, Roman urban planning made these individual building disasters into neighborhood catastrophes. Insulae were typically built with shared walls, so the collapse of one structure could trigger domino effects that brought down multiple buildings. The dense urban environment meant that debris from falling buildings often blocked streets, preventing rescue efforts and trapping survivors in areas where additional collapses were likely. As you settle into your straw-filled mattress on the 6th floor of your Roman apartment building, feeling the subtle vibrations that travel through the wooden frame with each gust of wind, you're participating in one of history's most dangerous experiments in urban living. The walls around you represent not protection, but potential weapons, waiting for the right combination of stress, whether it's in time to transform your bedroom into a tomb. But the question that haunts every Roman night is this: if the building itself doesn't kill you, what other lethal surprises has this ancient architecture prepared for those who dare to seek rest within its crumbling embrace? The oil lamp beside your bed flickers, casting dancing shadows on the cracked walls of your 6th-floor room. And you notice something deeply troubling. The flame seems to be drawing toward a gap in the wall where mortar has crumbled away. The draft suggests that the structural integrity of your building has deteriorated to the point where exterior winds can penetrate directly into interior spaces. And with that realization comes the understanding that your bedroom has become not just unstable, but actively dangerous in ways that extend far beyond simple structural collapse. Roman insulae bedrooms killed their occupants through a complex interaction of architectural failures, environmental hazards, and human desperation that created death traps more sophisticated than any weapon of war. The high-rise apartment blocks, particularly risky for those dwelling on upper floors, concentrated multiple lethal threats into spaces barely large enough for a single person to lie down. Fire represented the most immediate danger, as the combination of wooden construction, open flames, and overcrowded conditions created perfect conditions for conflagrations that could consume entire buildings in minutes. The fire hazard intensified dramatically with each floor you climbed above ground level. Juvenile's satirical but accurate description captured the terrifying reality. Smoke is pouring out of your third-floor attic, but you know nothing of it. By the time flames reached upper floors, escape routes were already blocked by smoke. Fire, or panicking residents trying to flee down the single narrow staircase. The wooden construction of upper stories meant that fires spread with explosive speed, often giving residents only minutes to escape from buildings that could take 10 or 15 minutes to evacuate under ideal conditions. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE demonstrated the apocalyptic potential of insulae fires on a citywide scale. The conflagration consumed entire districts filled with insulae, creating firestorms that jumped from building to building faster than residents could evacuate. The tightly packed neighborhoods amplified the disaster, as narrow streets filled with debris and fleeing people while buildings collapsed into roadways, blocking escape routes and trapping thousands of people in burning structures. But fire was only one component of a larger system of architectural lethality. The structural engineering of insulae created deadly scenarios that didn't require flames to claim lives. The combination of inadequate foundations, substandard construction materials, and excessive height created buildings that were essentially vertical disasters waiting to happen. The weight of 7 or 8 stories pressing down on inferior mortar and improperly baked bricks guaranteed that catastrophic collapse was inevitable. The only question was when. Roman building codes, such as they were, focused primarily on height restrictions rather than construction quality or safety standards. The 70-foot limit imposed by Augustus represented an acknowledgement that extremely tall buildings were inherently dangerous. But it did nothing to address the fundamental problems of poor materials and inadequate engineering that made even moderately tall insulae deadly. Buildings constructed before these regulations remained in use for decades, becoming increasingly unstable as years passed without significant maintenance or structural reinforcement. The economic pressures that drove insulae construction created a systematic disregard for human safety that would shock modern observers. Property developers maximized profits by building as cheaply as possible while charging rents that reflected desperate housing shortages rather than building quality. The result was a housing market where the poorest citizens, who could least afford medical care or alternative accommodations, were forced to live in the most dangerous buildings. Upper floor bedrooms presented unique dangers that reflected the intersection of structural instability and human desperation. Families often subdivided already tiny rooms to accommodate more people, reducing rent costs but creating overcrowded conditions that increased both fire hazards and the likelihood of injuries. During emergency evacuations, these cramped quarters, sometimes housing entire families in spaces smaller than modern closets, meant that residents had little room to maneuver and virtually no private storage for possessions, increasing the accumulation of flammable materials. In sleeping areas, the lack of windows in many upper floor rooms created additional hazards that compounded the basic structural dangers. Without natural light or ventilation, these spaces became breeding grounds for mold and bacteria that caused respiratory illnesses. The poor air quality was exacerbated by cooking smoke, oil lamp fumes, and human respiration in spaces with no air circulation, creating conditions that weakened residents' health and made them more vulnerable to other environmental hazards. Water supply problems in upper-story apartments created a cascade of additional dangers. Most insulae had water access only on lower floors, forcing upper-story residents to carry water up multiple flights of stairs daily. This need for water storage created fire hazards, as residents stockpiled flammable liquids like oil and wine, alongside water containers. The weight of stored liquids also contributed to floor loading that already compromised. Structural elements couldn't safely support. Sanitation problems in insulated bedrooms created health hazards that killed as efficiently as fires or collapses, though more slowly. Without access to bathroom facilities, upper-floor residents often resorted to chamber pots that were emptied by throwing contents out windows or down stairwells. This practice created unsanitary conditions that fostered disease, transmission, and attracted vermin populations that carried additional pathogens. The social dynamics within insulae created behavioral patterns that increased dangers for all residents. Desperate tenants sometimes deliberately started fires to destroy buildings where they could no longer afford rent, hoping to escape debt obligations in the chaos of disaster. These arson attempts often got out of control, killing not just the perpetrators but entire buildings full of innocent residents. Property owners sometimes engaged in similar behavior, destroying buildings they could no longer maintain, profitably rather than investing in necessary repairs. The nighttime dangers in insulated bedrooms were particularly acute because most residents worked during daylight hours and used their rooms primarily for sleeping. This meant that dangerous conditions often developed unnoticed during the day, creating lethal surprises for residents returning home after dark. Structural damage, fire hazards, or pest infestations could reach critical levels without anyone present to observe or address developing problems. Roman emergency response capabilities were completely inadequate for the scale of disasters that insulated architecture generated. The city had no organized fire department until Augustus created the vigils. And even this force was designed primarily to prevent fires rather than conduct rescue operations. The narrow streets, high buildings, and lack of proper firefighting equipment meant that once a major fire or collapse occurred, residents were essentially on their own. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of sudden death created its own health problems that further weakened insulated residents. Chronic stress from knowing that your bedroom could become your tomb at any moment contributed to various stress-related illnesses that were poorly understood by Roman medical practitioners. Sleep disorders, anxiety conditions, and depressive episodes were common among insulated residents, though these were typically attributed to supernatural causes rather than environmental stress. The architectural design of individual bedrooms within insulae reflected and amplified the larger structural problems of these buildings. Most cubicula were interior rooms without direct access to exterior walls, meaning that residents had no independent escape routes in case of emergency. The single doorway that provided access to the room could easily be blocked by debris, smoke, or other residents, creating death traps from which escape was impossible once disaster began. The cumulative effect of all these dangers meant that insulated bedrooms claimed lives through a variety of mechanisms that often worked in combination. A resident might survive the initial structural collapse that damaged their building, only to die from smoke inhalation as fires spread through the wreckage, or from injuries sustained while trying to escape through debris-locked stairwells. In darkness, as you blow out your oil lamp and prepare to sleep in your sixth-floor room, listening to the ominous creaking and settling sounds that emanate from the building's stressed structural elements, you understand that you're not simply going to bed, you're entering a sophisticated machine designed to kill its occupants through any of dozens of different mechanisms. The question isn't whether your building will eventually claim your life, but rather which particular combination of architectural failures will prove fatal, and whether you'll have any warning before your bedroom becomes your tomb. Yet, even as you contemplate these structural dangers, you might wonder, what if the building doesn't collapse? What if the flames don't reach you? What other lethal surprises has Roman domestic architecture prepared for those who dare to survive its more obvious threats? The building shudders again, more violently this time. and you realize that the storm outside has intensified beyond what the structure can safely withstand. Through the crack in your wall, you can see lightning illuminating the night sky. And with each thunderclap, the entire insulae flexes and groans like a living creature in pain. But it's not the storm itself that terrifies you, it's the realization that your building has reached the point where even normal weather conditions might trigger the catastrophic failure that Roman engineers always knew would come eventually. Tonight might be the night when the deadly mathematics of Roman architecture finally claims their inevitable tribute of human lives. The moment of structural collapse in a Roman insulae was both sudden and inexorable, the culmination of years, or decades of accumulated stress, environmental damage, and deferred maintenance that transformed buildings into enormous weapons pointed at their own residents. Eyewitness accounts describe the terrifying sequence of events that preceded major collapse as the way buildings would begin to speak through creaking timbers, shifting stones, and falling mortars, providing warnings that experienced residents learned to recognize but were usually powerless to act upon. The physics of insulae collapse revealed the deadly efficiency of Roman architectural failure. When critical structural elements finally gave way, the enormous weight of multiple stories created what modern engineers would recognize as a progressive collapse, each failing floor adding its mass to the destruction of floors below, accelerating the cascade until entire buildings crumbled into their own foundations within minutes. Residents sleeping in upper-story bedrooms had virtually no chance of survival once this process began, as escape routes were blocked by debris and falling structural elements. Long before the collapse reached their level, Cicero's casual mention of his collapsing properties reflected a broader social acceptance of architectural disaster that revealed how thoroughly Romans had internalized the deadly trade-offs of urban living. His observation that not only the tenants but the very mice have migrated suggested that even property owners viewed structural collapse as a normal business risk rather than a human tragedy. This normalization of disaster created a culture where preventable deaths were accepted as inevitable costs of urban development. The seasonal patterns of insulae disasters created predictable cycles of death that Romans learned to anticipate but never successfully prevented. Winter storms saturated weak mortar and exposed structural defects that had developed during dry summer months. Spring flooding undermined foundations and triggered landslides that destroyed entire buildings. Summer heat caused wooden elements to expand and contract, loosening joints and creating gaps that compromised structural integrity. Autumn brought high winds that tested buildings, already weakened by a year of accumulated damage. Roman legal systems struggled to address the human cost of architectural disasters, creating frameworks that protected property owners while leaving tenants vulnerable to preventable deaths. While tenants could theoretically terminate leases for unsafe buildings, proving that landlords were liable for injuries or deaths required evidence that gross negligence had occurred. Since most structural failures could be attributed to normal weather, or acts of the gods, successful liability claims were extremely rare, creating a legal environment that incentivized dangerous construction practices. The archaeological record provides sobering evidence of how frequently these disasters occurred and how little Roman society did to prevent them. Excavations throughout Rome have uncovered multiple layers of collapsed insulae, with new buildings constructed directly on top of debris from previous failures. The Insula dell'Ara Coeli on the Capitoline Hill, one of the few surviving examples, shows clear evidence of multiple reconstruction episodes, suggesting that the building collapsed and was rebuilt several times during its operational life. The human cost of these architectural experiments defies precise calculation, but literary evidence suggests that structural disasters claimed thousands of Roman lives annually. Strabo's observation about the unceasingly necessary reconstruction due to collapses and fires implies that building failures occurred frequently enough to sustain an entire construction. industry devoted to replacing destroyed structures. The economic incentives that drove this cycle of destruction and reconstruction meant that each generation of buildings was likely to be as dangerous as its predecessors. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE demonstrated how individual building failures could cascade into citywide catastrophes that killed tens of thousands of residents. The fire's ability to spread so rapidly and extensively reflected the accumulated vulnerabilities of thousands of insulae that had been constructed with minimal regard for safety. When these individual time bombs detonated simultaneously, they created a disaster that nearly destroyed the entire city. The social geography of architectural disaster created patterns of death that reflected and reinforced Roman class divisions. Wealthy Romans, who lived in ground-floor apartments with easy access to exits and superior construction, often survived disasters that killed the poor tenants trapped in upper-story death traps. This differential mortality meant that structural disasters functioned as a form of class warfare, systematically eliminating the most vulnerable members of Roman society while leaving the wealthy relatively unscathed. The long-term demographic impact of insulae disasters shaped Roman urban development in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The constant attrition of poor urban residents through architectural disasters may have created labor shortages that encouraged increased reliance on slave labor and rural migration. The psychological trauma of surviving building collapses likely contributed to the fatalistic attitudes toward death and disaster that characterized later Roman culture. Roman engineering knowledge was certainly sufficient to construct safe, multi-story buildings. The evidence lies in surviving structures like the Pantheon and various aqueducts that have remained stable for 2 millennia. The deadly flaws in insulae construction reflected economic and political choices rather than technical limitations, representing a conscious decision to prioritize profit over human life that created one of history's most lethal forms of domestic architecture. The failure to learn from repeated disasters revealed fundamental limitations in Roman approaches to urban planning and public safety. Despite centuries of experience with structural collapses, Roman cities continued to authorize construction methods that virtually guaranteed future disasters. The regulatory response to building failures typically focused on height restrictions, rather than construction quality, treating symptoms rather than causes, and ensuring that deadly practices would continue. Modern engineering analysis of surviving insulae remains reveals construction defects so severe that the buildings should never have been considered habitable. Foundations built on unstable soil, walls constructed with insufficient mortar, structural elements inadequate for their loads, and building techniques that ignored basic principles of structural engineering created buildings that were essentially elaborate traps designed to kill their inhabitants. The human stories behind these architectural disasters remain largely untold, as most victims were too poor and powerless to leave detailed records of their experiences. The slaves, freedmen, and working-class families who died in collapsing insulae disappeared from history as completely as their buildings crumbled into dust. Their deaths were recorded, if at all, as statistics rather than tragedies, contributing to a historical narrative that minimized the human cost of Roman urban development as dawn breaks over your 6th-floor room, and you realize that you've survived another night in your deadly architectural experiment. You understand that you've been participating in one of history's most dangerous forms of gambling. Every night you spend in this building represents a calculated risk that the accumulated stresses, environmental damage, and structural defects won't quite reach the critical threshold that triggers catastrophic failure. But the broader implications of Roman residential architecture extend far beyond individual survival. The insulae represents one of humanity's first attempts at mass urban housing, and their deadly flaws reveal fundamental tensions between economic efficiency, population, density, and human safety that continue to challenge urban planners today. The Roman solution, accepting high casualty rates as the price of affordable housing, created precedents and attitudes toward architectural risk that influenced urban development for centuries. The legacy of Roman insulae reminds us that architecture is never neutral. Every design choice reflects values, priorities, and assumptions about whose lives matter and what level of risk is acceptable in pursuit of economic goals. The Romans chose to build death traps because the alternative safe housing for the urban poor would have required investments and regulations that threaten the profit margins of property developers and the tax revenues of municipal governments. As you descend those creaking stairs for perhaps the last time, you carry with you the knowledge that survival in a Roman city required not just courage and resourcefulness, but also the kind of luck that allowed some residents to escape the architectural lottery, while others paid the ultimate price for Rome's urban ambitions. The question that haunts every step is whether modern cities have truly learned from Rome's deadly experiment, or whether we continue to build our own versions of insulae while telling ourselves that this time will be different. The tiny flame in your clay oil lamp flickers as you prepare for sleep, casting dancing shadows on the walls of your Roman cubiculum. This small light, barely bright enough to illuminate your sleeping area, represents both your only defense against the darkness and your greatest enemy, a concentrated source of ignition that transforms every night into a calculated gamble with fire. The olive oil burning in that simple ceramic vessel contains enough stored energy to reduce your entire neighborhood to ashes. And the precarious balance between light and destruction that defines Roman domestic life is about to play out once again in bedrooms across the empire. Roman oil lamps were marvels of ancient technology, but they were also incendiary devices that brought open flames directly into the most vulnerable spaces of human habitation. The basic design had remained essentially unchanged for centuries: a ceramic reservoir filled with olive oil or animal fat, connected to a wick that burned at the tip of a narrow spout. While elegant in its simplicity, this design concentrated intense heat and open flame in a small, portable package that could easily be knocked over, cracked by thermal stress, or simply forgotten until the oil supply was exhausted and flames began consuming the wick holder itself. The placement of oil lamps in Roman bedrooms created immediate fire hazards that most users accepted as necessary risks. Lamps needed to be positioned where they could provide useful light for evening activities, reading, personal grooming, intimate conversations, but close enough to the sleeping area that they could be quickly extinguished when rest was desired. This proximity meant that sleeping Romans were typically within arm's reach of open flames throughout the night, separated from potential immolation by only a few inches of space and the structural integrity of ceramic containers that could crack. Without warning, the quality of lamp construction varied dramatically based on economic factors that directly affected safety. Wealthy Romans could afford well-made lamps crafted by skilled potters, with thick walls, stable bases, and carefully designed wicks that burned consistently. Poor families often relied on cheaply made lamps with thin walls, uneven bases that made tipping likely, and poorly fitted wicks that could fall into the oil reservoir, creating sudden flare-ups that could ignite bedding or clothing before sleepers could react. The fuel used in Roman oil lamps created additional dangers that extended far beyond simple flame exposure. Olive oil, while relatively clean-burning compared to animal fats, could become rancid over time, producing thick smoke and acrid fumes that caused respiratory problems in poorly ventilated bedrooms. Animal fats, used by poorer households when olive oil was too expensive, burned with heavy smoke production and strong odors that made indoor air quality hazardous. Both fuel types created residues that accumulated in lamp reservoirs, creating deposits that could cause unexpected flare-ups or wick blockages that led to dangerous attempts at maintenance. While lamps were still burning, the ignition process itself presented daily hazards that Roman households simply accepted as routine. Lighting an oil lamp required access to an existing flame source, which meant maintaining small fires or hot coals throughout the day and night. These fire sources often kept in portable braziers or small hearths represented additional ignition hazards that multiplied the number of open flames present in Roman domestic spaces. The process of lighting a lamp in darkness required handling burning materials while half awake, creating numerous opportunities for accidents that could set clothing, bedding, or lamp fuel ablaze. Roman bedrooms typically contained multiple fire sources simultaneously, creating complex fire hazards that modern safety experts would find appalling. In addition to oil lamps for lighting, many rooms contained small braziers, portable metal containers filled with burning charcoal for heating. During cold weather, these braziers, called foculus by the Romans, provided warmth but also created carbon monoxide hazards and open flame exposure that could easily ignite surrounding materials. The combination of oil lamps and braziers in small, poorly ventilated spaces created atmospheric conditions that were both toxic and explosive. The seasonal patterns of fire risk reflected the complex relationship between Roman heating needs and available safety technology. Winter months required more intensive heating and longer periods of lamp use, dramatically increasing fire hazards just when escape from burning buildings became most difficult due to weather conditions. Summer brought different challenges, as hot weather made oil lamps more prone to overheating and thermal cracking, while the dry conditions typical of Mediterranean summers created tinder-like conditions that allowed small fires to spread rapidly through neighborhoods. The architectural context of Roman bedrooms amplified the dangers created by open flames. Most cubicula were small, windowless rooms with limited ventilation and furnishings made entirely from organic materials, wooden bed frames, woolen blankets, straw mattresses, and leather storage containers. These rooms functioned as kindling boxes waiting for ignition, where a single overturned lamp or poorly maintained brazier could create a conflagration that consumed everything within minutes. The social patterns of Roman evening activities created behavioral routines that increased fire risks in systematic ways. Families often used bedrooms for activities beyond sleeping, eating meals, conducting business, socializing with neighbors, and entertaining guests. These activities required extended periods of lamp illumination and often involved alcohol consumption that impaired judgment regarding fire safety. The combination of open flames, flammable surroundings, reduced awareness created nightly scenarios where disaster was always one careless moment away. Roman military manuals provide insight into institutional awareness of oil lamp dangers. Though this knowledge apparently didn't translate effectively into civilian safety practices, military camps had specific regulations governing lamp use, including requirements for lamp maintenance, restrictions on lamp placement, and procedures. For fire watch duties, the existence of these military protocols suggests that Roman authorities understood the fire risks associated with oil lamps, but chose not to implement similar safety measures in urban civilian environments. The economic dimensions of lamp safety created class-based differentials in fire risk that reflected broader patterns of Roman social inequality. Wealthy households could afford high-quality lamps, professional lamp maintenance services, and specialized servants trained in fire prevention and response. Poor families relied on whatever lighting they could afford, often using improvised or damaged lamps that created elevated fire risks. This differential meant that fire disasters disproportionately affected the poor, who lived in more crowded conditions with cheaper, more dangerous lighting equipment. The maintenance requirements of oil lamps created daily fire hazards that accumulated over time. Wicks needed regular trimming to prevent smoking and flare-ups, but this maintenance required handling sharp tools near open flames while dealing with hot oil. Lamp reservoirs required cleaning to remove accumulated residues, but this process involved handling flammable solvents and potentially contaminated materials. The frequency of required maintenance meant that households were constantly performing dangerous procedures involving fire. sharp objects, and toxic substances. The psychological impact of living with constant fire hazards created a form of chronic stress that affected Roman sleep quality and mental health. The knowledge that every night brought the possibility of death by fire, combined with the necessity of maintaining open flames for basic activities, created anxiety conditions that manifested in sleep disorders, hypervigilance, and various stress-related physical symptoms. Roman medical texts describe numerous ailments that modern physicians would recognize as anxiety disorders, though contemporary practitioners attributed these conditions to supernatural or humoral causes rather than environmental stress. The Roman approach to fire prevention relied primarily on religious and magical practices rather than practical safety measures. Households often maintained shrines to Vesta, goddess of the hearth, seeking divine protection against fire disasters. Amulets and charms were commonly placed near oil lamps and braziers, reflecting belief that supernatural intervention could prevent accidents. While these practices provided psychological comfort, they did nothing to address the fundamental technological and architectural factors that made Roman domestic fire hazards so deadly as you trim the wick of your oil lamp and check the oil level before settling into bed. You're performing a ritual that millions of Romans repeated nightly, balancing the need for light and warmth against the ever-present possibility that tonight might be the night when a moment's carelessness or a defective lamp transforms your bedroom into an inferno. The flame that provides comfort and security is simultaneously the instrument that could destroy everything you own and everyone you love, creating a tension that defines the Roman experience of domestic life. But oil lamps were merely the most obvious fire hazard in Roman bedrooms. What other sources of ignition lurked in the darkness of Roman nights? And how did the very systems designed to provide warmth and comfort become the instruments of destruction that claimed more Roman lives than foreign armies? The charcoal in your small bronze brazier glows cherry red in the darkness, providing welcome warmth against the October chill that seeps through the gaps in your apartment's mud brick walls. But as you watch the dancing flames and listen to the soft hissing of burning fuel, you begin to notice something troubling. The air in your windowless cubiculum has become thick and heavy, making each breath require conscious effort. What you're experiencing isn't just discomfort, it's the early stages of carbon monoxide poisoning, one of the silent killers that transformed Roman heating systems from sources of comfort into instruments of death. Roman braziers represented a technological compromise that brought both comfort and mortal danger into the most intimate spaces of domestic life. These portable metal containers, filled with glowing charcoal or wood embers, provided controllable heat sources that could warm individual rooms or specific areas within larger spaces. The foculus, as Romans called their braziers, became essential equipment for winter survival, but they also introduced open flames, toxic gases, and extreme heat sources directly into bedrooms, where families slept in enclosed spaces with minimal ventilation. The chemistry of combustion in Roman braziers created atmospheric hazards that ancient science couldn't identify or understand. The incomplete combustion of charcoal and wood in oxygen-limited environments produced carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that displaced oxygen in the bloodstream and could kill sleeping victims without warning. Roman physicians observed that people sometimes died mysteriously in heated rooms, but they attributed these deaths to supernatural causes or humoral imbalances rather than recognizing the invisible atmospheric poison that their heating systems generated. The design of Roman domestic architecture amplified the dangers created by brazier use. Most cubicula lacked windows and depended on doorways for air circulation, creating spaces where combustion gases could accumulate to lethal concentrations. The small size of typical bedrooms meant that even modest braziers could quickly consume available oxygen and fill rooms with toxic fumes. The practice of sealing rooms against winter cold-blocking drafts with fabric or temporary Atarius created nearly Airtight spaces where carbon monoxide poisoning was virtually inevitable. Archaeological evidence suggests that Romans developed some awareness of the health hazards associated with indoor burning, though they lacked the scientific knowledge to understand the underlying mechanisms. Vitruvius warned against certain types of indoor fires, noting that winter dining rooms with frequent fires suffered damage to paintings and decorative elements from smoke and soot accumulation. His observations reflected recognition that indoor combustion created harmful atmospheric conditions, but Roman solutions focused on protecting property rather than human health. The fuel choices available to Roman households created different types of atmospheric hazards that reflected economic and social stratification. Wealthy families could afford high-quality charcoal that burned more cleanly and produced fewer toxic byproducts. Poor households often burned whatever combustible materials they could obtain: wood scraps, dried animal dung, refuse, or low-grade charcoal contaminated with impurities. These inferior fuels produced heavy smoke, toxic fumes, and inconsistent heat, while consuming oxygen more rapidly than cleaner burning alternatives. The temporal patterns of brazier use created daily cycles of atmospheric poisoning that coincided with periods of maximum human vulnerability. Evening lighting of braziers filled bedrooms with combustion products just as families prepared for sleep, creating conditions where carbon monoxide concentrations could build throughout the night, while occupants remained unconscious and unable to recognize symptoms of poisoning. Morning discoveries of mysteriously dead family members probably represented carbon monoxide fatalities, though Roman medical knowledge attributed these deaths to disease, witchcraft, or divine punishment. Roman military experience provided some institutional knowledge about the dangers of enclosed fires, though this awareness didn't translate effectively into civilian safety practices. Military camps had regulations governing fire use in tents and temporary structures, including requirements for ventilation and restrictions on brazier placement. These military protocols suggest that experienced soldiers understood the need for air circulation around heating fires, but civilian populations lacked access to this specialized knowledge. The seasonal nature of heating hazards created predictable cycles of death that Romans came to accept as natural consequences of winter weather. Cold months brought increased brazier use just as architectural modifications sealing windows, blocking drafts, hanging heavy curtains reduced air circulation to minimum levels. The combination of intensive fuel consumption and restricted ventilation created perfect conditions for carbon monoxide accumulation that claimed lives throughout the winter season. The social dynamics within Roman households created behavioral patterns that increased exposure to heating hazards. Families often gathered in heated rooms for evening meals, conversation, and entertainment, creating situations where multiple people were exposed to toxic atmospheric conditions simultaneously. Children and elderly family members, who were most vulnerable to carbon monoxide poisoning, often spent extended periods in heated spaces while adult household members worked elsewhere. The physical placement of braziers within bedrooms created complex fire hazards that extended beyond simple flame exposure. Braziers needed to be elevated above floor level to create proper airflow for combustion. But this elevation brought glowing coals and open flames closer to flammable materials like bedding, clothing, and wooden furniture. The portable nature of braziers meant they could be easily knocked over by accident, spilling burning coals onto floors covered with straw or other combustible materials. Roman tisle presented particularly deadly environments for brazier use, as the multi-story construction concentrated heating hazards in buildings with limited escape routes. Archaeological evidence suggests that braziers were found on each floor of insulae, creating multiple sources of ignition that could trigger cascading fires throughout entire buildings. The combination of wooden construction, crowded conditions, and numerous heat sources created perfect conditions for conflagrations that could consume entire blocks of apartments within hours. The maintenance requirements of Roman heating systems created daily hazards that accumulated into serious safety. Risks over time. Braziers required regular cleaning to remove ash and debris that could interfere with proper combustion or create unexpected flare-ups. Fuel needed to be handled and stored safely, but Roman households often kept combustible materials in the same rooms where fires burned, creating situations where fuel supplies could ignite unexpectedly. The process of lighting and tending braziers required handling. Burning materials in close proximity to other flammable objects. The economic pressures that drove Roman domestic energy use created systemic safety compromises that increased heating. Hazards across all social classes. Even wealthy households faced trade-offs between comfort, safety, and cost. As fuel expenses during cold winters could represent significant portions of family budgets. Poor families often resorted to burning whatever materials they could obtain for free, regardless of safety considerations, creating situations where desperation for warmth overcame concerns about fire safety or atmospheric contamination. The medical consequences of chronic exposure to combustion products created long-term health problems that Roman physicians couldn't properly diagnose or treat. Repeated low-level carbon monoxide exposure caused neurological damage that manifested as memory problems, coordination difficulties, and personality changes that were attributed to aging, disease, or supernatural causes. Respiratory problems from smoke and particulate exposure created chronic conditions that weakened immune systems and made individuals more susceptible to other diseases. Historical speculation suggests that some prominent Romans may have died from heating-related poisoning, though definitive evidence remains elusive. A 1998 article in the Journal of Toxicology proposed that Emperor Julian may have suffered carbon monoxide poisoning and that his successor Emperor Jovian died from it. Though these conclusions remain controversial among historians, the possibility that imperial deaths resulted from common domestic heating hazards illustrates how pervasive and democratic these dangers were in Roman society. The legacy of Roman heating hazards extended far beyond individual fatalities to create demographic patterns that shaped urban development and social policy. Areas with high concentrations of brazier-heated housing experienced elevated mortality rates that particularly affected children, elderly residents, and pregnant women's populations, most vulnerable to carbon monoxide poisoning. These demographic impacts may have influenced Roman approaches to urban planning, though connections between heating hazards and public health weren't explicitly recognized by contemporary authorities. As you adjust the airflow around your brazier, and notice how the flames shift color with changes in oxygen availability. You're witnessing the same chemical processes that killed thousands of Romans, who sought nothing more than warmth and comfort during cold nights. The glowing coals that provide life-sustaining heat are simultaneously consuming the life-sustaining oxygen in your sealed bedroom, creating a deadly competition between human respiration and fuel combustion that can end only with the extinguishing of one or the other. But the dangers of Roman heating extended beyond simple poisoning to create complex fire hazards that could destroy entire neighborhoods. How did the Romans' attempts to stay warm during winter nights transform their cities into vast networks of potential conflagrations? And what price did they pay for the comfort that these heating systems provided? The first wisps of smoke curling from beneath your neighbor's door tell a story you've witnessed too many times before. Another Roman family has fallen asleep without properly extinguishing their brazier, and now the glowing coals have ignited their straw mattress or wooden bed frame. Within minutes, flames will be eating through the thin wooden walls that separate your apartment from theirs, and the narrow staircase that represents your only escape route will be filled with choking smoke and panicked residents fleeing the upper floors. This is how Roman neighborhoods died, not in single blazes, but in cascading conflagrations that jumped from building to building faster than residents could evacuate. consuming entire districts in a matter of hours. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE revealed the ultimate consequences of a heating and lighting system that brought thousands of open flames into close contact with buildings constructed almost entirely from combustible materials. The fire began in shops beneath the circus, Maximus likely ignited by an overturned oil lamp or poorly tended brazier, and spread through the closely packed insulae with explosive speed. Within 6 days, the conflagration had consumed 14 of Rome's administrative districts, destroying thousands of buildings and killing countless residents trapped in upper-story apartments with no escape routes. The physics of fire spread in Roman residential areas created perfect conditions for urban conflagrations that could consume entire cities. The wooden construction of insulae upper floors, combined with the use of timber and mud brick in structural elements, meant that buildings were essentially vertical arrays of kindling waiting for ignition. The close proximity of structures often sharing walls or separated by narrow alleyways allowed fires to jump between buildings through radiant heat, flying embers, and direct flame contact. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii provides detailed insight into how Roman heating and lighting systems contributed to urban fire disasters. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE preserved a snapshot of Roman domestic life that includes numerous examples of fire damage that occurred during the earthquake that preceded the volcanic explosion. Excavators found evidence that oil lamps falling during seismic activity had started multiple fires throughout the city, with chaos followed the earthquake. Fires caused by oil lamps that had fallen during the tremor documented in the archaeological record. The Roman understanding of fire behavior was sophisticated enough to recognize the dangers of urban conflagration, but institutional responses focused more on fighting fires after they started than preventing ignition in the first place. Augustus created the Vigils, a specialized firefighting force in response to repeated urban fire disasters. But this organization was designed primarily for fire suppression rather than fire prevention. The Vigils were equipped with water, pumps, axes, and other firefighting tools. But they had no authority to regulate dangerous heating and lighting practices in private residences. The social geography of Roman fire disasters revealed how heating hazards disproportionately affected the urban poor, while often sparing wealthy households. Wealthy Romans lived in ground-floor apartments or private domas with superior construction, better heating systems, and easy access to exits. Poor families crowded into upper-story insulae apartments had to rely on dangerous portable heating, faced longer escape routes through narrow stairwells, and lived in buildings constructed with the cheapest available materials. When fires started, the wealthy could escape while the poor were trapped. The seasonal patterns of fire disasters reflected the complex relationship between heating needs, weather conditions, and urban fire risk. Winter months brought increased use of heating fires just when dry conditions and strong winds created optimal conditions for fire spread. The combination of intensive fuel consumption, sealed buildings with restricted ventilation, and atmospheric conditions that favored rapid flame propagation created perfect storms of urban destruction that occurred with predictable regularity. The economic impact of repeated fire disasters shaped Roman urban development in ways that perpetuated rather than resolved the underlying safety problems. Property developers could maximize profits by constructing buildings as cheaply as possible, knowing that fire losses would be borne by tenants rather than owners. The rapid reconstruction that followed major fires typically replicated the same dangerous design patterns that had caused previous disasters, creating cycles of destruction and rebuilding that enriched construction industries while claiming thousands of lives. The technological limitations of Roman firefighting capabilities meant that once major fires began, suppression efforts were largely futile. Water supply systems, while sophisticated for their time, couldn't deliver sufficient volumes at adequate pressure to suppress large structural fires. The narrow streets that characterized Roman neighborhoods prevented effective positioning of firefighting equipment, and often became blocked by fleeing residents or collapsed buildings. Wind conditions could spread fires faster than firefighters could move their equipment, creating situations where entire districts burned while suppression forces watched helplessly. The human behavior during fire emergencies created additional hazards that transformed individual building fires into neighborhood catastrophes. Panicked residents often made dangerous decisions instead of evacuating immediately, using stairwells that were already compromised by smoke or structural damage, or jumping from upper-story windows rather than attempting organized evacuation. The crowded conditions in Insulae meant that evacuation routes became bottlenecks where residents trampled each other in their desperation to escape. The legal and insurance frameworks that governed fire losses created perverse incentives that actually increased fire hazards throughout Roman cities. Property owners sometimes found it more profitable to allow buildings to burn rather than investing in maintenance or safety improvements, as reconstruction costs could be lower than repair expenses. Some property owners deliberately started fires to collect insurance payments or escape debt obligations, creating additional sources of ignition that contributed to urban fire risk. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of fire death created chronic anxiety conditions that affected sleep quality and mental health throughout Roman urban populations. The knowledge that every night brought the possibility of death by fire, combined with the necessity of maintaining heating and lighting systems that created fire hazards, produced stress-related disorders that manifested as insomnia, hypervigilance, and various psychosomatic symptoms. Roman medical texts describe numerous ailments that modern physicians would recognize as anxiety disorders related to environmental stress. The cultural responses to fire hazards reflected both practical adaptation and supernatural coping mechanisms that characterized Roman approaches to uncontrollable dangers. Religious practices included sacrifices and prayers to gods associated with fire protection, particularly Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Household shrines often included protective amulets and charms designed to ward off fire disasters. These spiritual responses provided psychological comfort, but did nothing to address the technological and architectural factors that made fire disasters inevitable. The demographic consequences of repeated fire disasters shaped Roman urban population dynamics in ways that historians are still investigating. Fire deaths disproportionately affected children, elderly residents, and pregnant women populations with reduced mobility or special vulnerability to smoke inhalation. The selective mortality created by fire disasters may have influenced Roman approaches to urban planning, immigration policy, and social welfare systems. Though these connections weren't explicitly recognized by contemporary authorities, the international dimensions of Roman fire hazards reflected the empire's urban development patterns and architectural technologies throughout the Mediterranean world. Cities throughout the Roman Empire adopted similar heating and lighting technologies, construction methods, and urban planning approaches, creating networks of fire-prone settlements that experienced similar patterns of disaster. The standardization of dangerous technologies across the empire meant that fire disasters weren't isolated local problems, but systematic failures that affected millions of residents. The legacy of Roman fire hazards extended far beyond the ancient world to influence European urban development for centuries after the empire's collapse. Medieval cities inherited Roman approaches to heating, lighting, and construction that perpetuated fire hazards well into the modern era. The Great Fire of London in 1666, the Chicago Fire of 1871, and numerous other urban conflagrations reflected technological and architectural patterns that could be traced back to Roman precedents as you smell the increasingly strong smoke seeping through your apartment walls and hear the growing sounds of panic from neighboring buildings. You realize that you're witnessing the final act of a drama that played out thousands of times throughout Roman history. The heating and lighting systems that provided comfort and security or simultaneously the instruments that could destroy everything Romans had built, creating a fundamental contradiction in urban life that ancient technology couldn't resolve. The choice facing every Roman resident was ultimately simple but terrible: freeze in darkness or risk incineration by maintaining the fires that made winter survival possible. Most chose warmth and light, accepting the odds that their particular building might escape destruction for one more night. But statistics were inexorable, and every Roman city contained thousands of families playing this same deadly lottery, knowing that some of them would lose everything before dawn broke over the empire once again. The question that haunts Roman urban history is whether these fire disasters represented unavoidable consequences of ancient technology, or whether they reflected deeper failures of social organization that prioritized economic efficiency over human safety. The answer might determine whether we view Roman cities as unfortunate victims of technological limitations, or as early examples of urban development patterns that continue to sacrifice lives for profits in cities around the world today. The rope netting beneath your body sags deeper tonight than it did yesterday, and the wooden frame of your Roman bed creaks with each slight movement as you settle into sleep. What you're experiencing isn't simply the natural settling of furniture. Under use, it's the gradual failure of structural elements that were never designed to support the loads they're carrying. Your bed, like the building that houses it and the city that contains them both, represents a complex system of structural compromises that could fail catastrophically at any moment, transforming the most basic human need for rest into a potentially fatal act of faith in the strength of materials and the competence of ancient engineering. Roman beds were engineering challenges disguised as furniture, requiring builders to create elevated sleeping surfaces that could support human weight, while resisting the constant stresses of movement, moisture, and time. The most common design wooden frames, strung with rope netting and topped with thin mattresses, represented a sophisticated approach to distributed load support, but one that was vulnerable to multiple modes of failure. The wooden posts could crack under stress, the rope netting could stretch and eventually snap, and the joints where components connected could work loose over time, creating beds that became progressively less stable with each night of use. The construction materials available to Roman furniture makers created inherent limitations that affected the safety and durability of sleeping systems across all social classes. Even wealthy Romans, who could afford beds made from exotic precious woods like the lecti pavonine, finished to shine like peacock feathers, faced structural challenges that ancient technology couldn't fully overcome. Wood was subject to expansion and contraction with temperature and humidity changes, creating stresses in joints and connections that could accumulate over time. Metal components, bronze inlays, iron fittings, or decorative elements corroded differently than wood, creating stress concentrations where dissimilar materials met. The social stratification that characterized Roman society extended to bed construction in ways that directly affected structural safety. Poor families often relied on beds made from terracotta or fired clay, essentially ceramic platforms that were cheap to produce but brittle and prone to sudden catastrophic failure. These clay beds, sometimes nothing more than rectangular blocks, with thin mattresses placed on top, could shatter without warning if subjected to impact loads or thermal stresses, potentially causing serious injuries to sleeping occupants. The rope and leather suspension systems that supported Roman mattresses represented complex engineering solutions that were vulnerable to predictable failure modes. The archaeological evidence from Civita Juliana shows beds with wooden posts strung with thin rope arranged like netting, creating woven suspension systems that distributed loads across multiple support points. But rope and leather both degraded over time. Rope fibers weakened and broke, leather dried and cracked, and the organic materials attracted insects and rodents that could chew through critical load-bearing elements. The integration of Roman Beds into the broader architectural context created situations where furniture failures could trigger cascading structural collapses that affected entire buildings. In the crowded insulae where most Romans lived, beds were often positioned against load-bearing walls or placed in areas where their collapse could damage critical structural elements. A heavy wooden bed frame falling against a mud brick wall could create cracks that compromise the wall's ability to support floors above, potentially triggering progressive collapses that brought down entire sections of buildings. The loading conditions that Roman beds had to withstand extended far beyond simple human body weight to include dynamic forces that ancient furniture wasn't designed to accommodate. Roman beds served multiple functions beyond sleeping. They were used for eating, socializing, conducting business, and storing possessions. This multifunctional use created loading patterns that could exceed design limits, particularly when multiple people gathered on single beds for meals or conversations. The dynamic loads created by movement, combined with static loads from people and possessions, could stress furniture components beyond their failure points. The maintenance requirements of Roman bed construction created ongoing safety challenges that most households weren't equipped to address effectively. Wooden components needed regular inspection and repair to address damage from insects, moisture, and wear. Rope and leather suspension systems required periodic replacement as materials stretched and degraded. But most Roman families lacked the skills, tools, or resources necessary for proper furniture maintenance, creating situations where beds became progressively less safe over time until catastrophic failures occurred. The environmental conditions within Roman buildings created accelerated degradation patterns that compromised bed structural integrity in predictable ways. The small, poorly ventilated cubicula that served as bedrooms retained humidity that promoted wood rot and accelerated the decomposition of organic materials. The use of oil lamps and braziers created temperature fluctuations that caused expansion and contraction cycles in wooden bed frames, loosening joints and creating stress concentrations that could lead to sudden failures. The economic pressures that drove Roman furniture production created systematic compromises in construction quality that increased failure risks across all price ranges. Even wealthy households faced trade-offs between cost and durability that affected bed safety. Furniture makers could maximize profits by using minimum acceptable materials and construction methods, creating beds that met immediate functional requirements but lacked the structural margins necessary for long-term safety. The absence of regulatory standards for furniture construction meant that consumers had no reliable way to assess structural quality before failures occurred. The seasonal patterns of bed failures reflected the interaction between environmental conditions and material properties in ways that Romans could observe but not fully understand. Winter brought increased humidity and temperature fluctuations that affected wooden components, while spring thaws could cause sudden dimensional changes in materials that had been stable during cold weather. Summer heat could accelerate the degradation of organic materials like rope and leather, while autumn brought increased pest activity that could compromise structural elements through insect damage. The consequences of bed collapse extended beyond immediate physical injuries to create broader safety hazards that affected entire households. A collapsing bed could scatter oil lamps or knock over braziers, creating fire hazards that threatened entire buildings. Falling bed components could block doorways or damage other furniture, creating obstacles that could prevent emergency evacuation. The sudden noise and chaos of bed collapse could cause panic reactions that led to additional injuries as family members attempted to respond to unexpected emergencies in darkness. The medical implications of bed-related injuries created healthcare challenges that Roman physicians were poorly equipped to address. Injuries from falling bed components or collapse-related impacts often involved complex fractures, head trauma, or crushing injuries that exceeded the treatment capabilities of quosies, abilities of ancient medicine. The lack of effective surgical techniques, anesthesia or antibiotics, meant that injuries that would be treatable today often resulted in permanent disability or death in the Roman world. The social dynamics within Roman households created behavioral mammo. The lack of effective soldier corn. The lack of effective surgical techniques, endesthesia, or entisimo, or enlasticisia. They are beplacid or polesia. It is played for lucis ed, exected my misicat. We are lie beloved. We alive, we are love. We are belied, we are polive. Assisted of Kala a lie with their mond. I see a lie it sai be mixat me it I key gets it to let's six to sit to by to skit to cock hold it to by to last. These later deducted the be it God that picket my spirit but they up a face patterns that increased exposure to bed-related structural hazards. Family groups often shared beds out of necessity or social custom, creating situations where single furniture failures could affect multiple people simultaneously. Children, who were most vulnerable to injuries from falling objects, often slept in the same rooms where adults used potentially unstable furniture for various activities. The architectural context of Roman sibs created situations where furniture failures could interact with building structural problems to create compound disasters. In the poorly constructed insulae where most Romans lived, the vibrations and impacts from bed collapses could trigger cracks in weakened walls or ceilings, potentially causing progressive structural failures that affected neighboring apartments. The interconnected nature of insulate construction meant that problems in one unit could cascade throughout entire buildings. The technological limitations of Roman engineering created systematic vulnerabilities in bed design that couldn't be overcome with available materials and construction methods. The absence of high-strength adhesives, precision metalworking capabilities, or advanced material science meant that Roman furniture makers had to rely on relatively crude joinery techniques that were vulnerable to stress, concentration, and fatigue failure. Even the most skilled craftsmen couldn't compensate for the fundamental limitations of available technology. As you listen to the increasingly frequent creaking sounds from your bed frame and notice how the rope netting has begun to sag in new places, you're witnessing the slow-motion structural failure that characterized Roman approaches to furniture engineering. Every night you spend in this bed represents a calculated risk that the accumulated stresses, environmental damage, and material degradation haven't quite reached the critical threshold that will transform your sleeping surface into a collection of broken components and potential weapons, but the structural vulnerabilities of individual beds represented only the most immediate layer of a much larger pattern of Roman engineering compromises that extended from furniture to buildings to entire urban infrastructure systems. What happens when the same approach to structural engineering that makes beds dangerous is applied to the construction of the buildings that house them? The sound of splintering wood from your bed frame coincides perfectly with a deep, resonant crack that seems to emanate from the walls themselves, and you realize with growing alarm that the structural failure of your sleeping furniture might be connected to larger problems with the building that contains it. The same engineering compromises material limitations and economic pressures that make Roman beds dangerous have been applied to the construction of the insulate themselves, creating 7-story monuments to structural failure that house hundreds of families in various states of slow-motion collapse. Roman insulae represented humanity's first attempt at mass-produced high-rise housing. But the engineering challenges of vertical construction proved far more complex than ancient builders anticipated. The fundamental problem lay in the interaction between height, weight, and structural materials as buildings grew taller. The loads on lower-level structural elements increased exponentially, but the materials available to Roman engineers couldn't provide the strength-to-weight ratios necessary for safe, tall construction. The result was buildings that were inherently unstable, becoming more dangerous with each additional story. The construction techniques used in Insulae revealed systematic engineering failures that guaranteed eventual structural collapse. Builders used inadequate mortar mixtures with insufficient lime content, creating bonds between structural elements that were weaker than the materials they connected. Improperly baked bricks absorbed water and dissolved under load, transforming solid walls into crumbling masses. The interior cores of walls consisted of crude mixtures of rubble and clay that turned to mud when wet, eliminating any structural strength they might have provided. The social geography of Insulae. Construction created architectural conditions that reflected and amplified Roman class divisions through differential structural safety. Ground floors featured substantial brick-faced concrete construction that could support considerable loads, making them suitable for expensive shops and wealthy residents. But as construction progressed upward, economic pressures forced the use of progressively lighter and less reliable materials, timber framing, and mud brick for upper stories where poor families lived, creating vertical slums where structural safety decreased with altitude. The loading conditions that Insulae had, to withstand exceeded the capabilities of Roman structural engineering in ways that builders must have recognized but chose to ignore. 7 or 8 stories of masonry, timber, and human occupants created dead loads that stressed foundations and lower-level structural elements beyond their capacity. Live loads from hundreds of residents, along with their possessions, furniture, and daily activities, added dynamic stresses that ancient materials couldn't accommodate safely. Wind loads on tall, narrow structures created lateral forces that required engineering solutions Roman builders didn't possess. The maintenance requirements of multi-story construction created ongoing structural challenges that Roman property owners routinely ignored for economic reasons. Masonry structures require periodic repointing. Timber elements need replacement when they rot or suffer insect damage, and foundations must be maintained to prevent settlement. But property owners could maximize profits by deferring maintenance costs, allowing structural elements to deteriorate until failure became inevitable. Cicero's personal experience with structural failures illustrated how normalized building collapse had become in Roman urban life. His complaint that 2 of my shops have fallen down and the rest are cracking. So not only the tenants, but the very mice have migrated revealed several important aspects of Roman structural failure patterns. First, that collapses often occurred in clusters as building problems affected multiple structures simultaneously. Second, that even animals possessed better survival instincts than human tenants, abandoning dangerous buildings before complete failure occurred. The predictive indicators of structural failure were well known to Roman residents. But economic necessity prevented most families from acting on this knowledge. Juvenile's satirical description captured the daily reality, bidding the inmates sleep at ease under a roof ready to tumble about their ears. The imagery wasn't metaphorical Roman. Residents could literally see and hear their buildings failing around them through cracking walls, sagging floors, and the sounds of structural elements under stress. The cascade effects of structural failure in densely packed urban environments meant that individual building collapses often triggered neighborhood disasters. Insulae often shared walls with neighboring buildings, so the collapse of one structure could damage adjacent buildings that were already operating near their structural limits. Falling debris could block streets, preventing rescue operations and creating conditions where survivors were trapped in areas where additional collapses were likely. The environmental factors that accelerated structural deterioration created predictable seasonal patterns of building failure. Winter rains saturated inferior mortars and clay-based construction materials, weakening structural bonds just as heating requirements created additional fire hazards. Spring thaws caused sudden foundation movements that could trigger catastrophic failures in buildings already compromised by years of settlement and loading. Summer heat created thermal expansion. Stresses in mixed material construction that loosened joints and opened cracks. The legal and regulatory frameworks that governed Roman construction created perverse incentives that prioritized short-term profits over long-term structural safety. Property developers could maximize returns by building as cheaply as possible, knowing that structural failures would primarily affect poor tenants who lacked legal recourse. The height restrictions imposed by Augustus represented acknowledgement that extremely tall buildings were dangerous. But these regulations didn't address fundamental problems of construction quality that made even moderately tall buildings deadly. The human behavioral responses to living in failing structures created additional hazards that compounded the basic structural dangers. Families often modify their apartments by removing walls or adding partitions, inadvertently compromising structural elements they didn't recognize as load-bearing. The practice of storing heavy materials, grain, water, oil, tools in upper story apartments added loads that already marginal structures couldn't support safely. The economic dynamics of Roman real estate created cycles of destruction and reconstruction that perpetuated rather than solved underlying structural problems. When buildings collapsed, property owners often found it cheaper to construct new buildings on the same sites, using the same dangerous methods rather than investing in superior construction that would reduce profits. Strabo observed this pattern, noting the building of houses, which goes on unceasingly in consequence of the collapses and fires and repeated sales. The medical consequences of structural collapses created healthcare crises that Roman medical systems couldn't address effectively. Crushing injuries, multiple fractures, and head trauma from building collapses typically exceeded the treatment capabilities of ancient medicine. The sudden nature of structural failures meant that multiple casualties often occurred simultaneously, overwhelming available medical resources and creating situations where treatable injuries became fatal due to lack of adequate care. The demographic impact of structural disasters shaped Roman urban population patterns in ways that reflected and reinforced social inequality. Building collapses disproportionately killed poor residents who lived in the most dangerous upper-story apartments, while wealthy families in ground-floor accommodations often survived disasters that destroyed the buildings above them. This differential mortality created urban environments where structural hazards functioned as mechanisms of class-based population control. The technological limitations of Roman engineering created fundamental constraints that couldn't be overcome through better design or construction practices. The absence of high-strength steel, reinforced concrete, or advanced understanding of structural dynamics meant that Roman builders were attempting to solve modern engineering problems with ancient tools and materials. Even the most skilled architects and engineers couldn't compensate for the basic limitations of available technology. The archaeological evidence from surviving insulae reveals construction defects so severe that modern building codes would never permit such structures to be occupied. The Insula dell'Ara Coeli on the Capitoline Hill, preserved beneath a medieval church, shows evidence of multiple reconstruction episodes that suggest the building collapsed and was rebuilt several times during its operational life. The surviving masonry reveals misaligned floors, inadequate foundations, and structural elements that were clearly insufficient for the loads they were expected to carry. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of structural collapse created chronic stress conditions that affected the mental and physical health of insulae residents. The daily awareness that your home could become your tomb at any moment contributed to anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, and various stress-related physical symptoms. Roman medical texts describe numerous ailments that modern physicians would recognize as consequences of environmental stress, though contemporary practitioners attributed these conditions to supernatural or humoral causes. As the creaking and settling sounds from your building intensify and you notice new cracks appearing in walls that seemed solid yesterday, you begin to understand that you're not simply living in a dangerous building, you're participating in one of history's most lethal experiments in urban engineering. Every night you spend in this insula represents survival in a structure that was designed to fail, where the question isn't whether collapse will occur, but whether you'll be lucky enough to escape when it does. But even if your particular building manages to survive another night, the broader implications of Roman structural engineering extend far beyond individual survival. Two questions about the prices societies are willing to pay for urban development. What happens when an entire civilization chooses to build its cities using construction methods that guarantee the deaths of thousands of residents in pursuit of economic efficiency? The final crack spreads across your bedroom ceiling like lightning, frozen in plaster, and in the sudden silence that follows the last groaning protest of overstressed timber, you realize that your Roman insula has reached the moment that engineers and residents alike have been expecting for years, the catastrophic structural failure that will transform a 7-story apartment building into tons of rubble and debris in a matter of seconds. This isn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of architectural disaster that characterized Roman urban life, where the systematic acceptance of deadly construction practices created cities that regularly consumed their own inhabitants. Through the collapse of buildings designed to fail, the physics of Roman insulae collapse revealed engineering disasters that rivaled the most catastrophic structural failures in human history. The Fidna Amphitheater collapse in 27 CE, which killed 20,000 spectators, demonstrated the ultimate consequences of Roman approaches to construction that prioritized cost savings over structural safety. The amphitheater, built by a freedman named Attilius, who cut costs by using inadequate foundations and substandard materials, collapsed under the weight of packed crowds, creating what remains history's deadliest structural failure. The Fidna disaster revealed patterns that characterized Roman construction across all building types, from amphitheaters to insulate to individual homes. The collapse occurred because builders attempted to support massive loads with structural systems that were fundamentally inadequate for the forces involved. The same engineering compromises that killed 20,000 people at Fidna were replicated thousands of times throughout the Roman Empire in residential buildings where families slept unaware that their homes were essentially weapons pointed at their own inhabitants. The process of progressive collapse in Roman buildings followed predictable sequences that engineering analysis can reconstruct with terrifying precision. Initial failures typically began in lower-level structural elements that had been overstressed. For years, a foundation settlement, a critical beam failure, or the collapse of a load-bearing wall weakened by poor mortar. Once the failure cascade began, the enormous weight of multiple stories created momentum that no remaining structural elements could resist. The eyewitness accounts of Roman building collapses preserved in contemporary literature capture both the sudden violence of structural failure and the helplessness of residents trapped in collapsing buildings. Aulus Gellius described watching a certain insula with many high floors consumed by the kind of catastrophic failure that could reduce 7-story buildings to ground-level rubble piles in less time than it took residents on upper floors to reach stairwells. The casualty patterns from Roman structural collapses reflected the social geography of architectural inequality that characterized urban life throughout the empire. Ground-floor residents, wealthy merchants, and property owners survived building collapses because they lived in areas with the strongest construction and easiest escape routes. Upper-floor residents, poor families, slaves, and working-class tenants bore the greatest risks because they occupied the weakest parts of buildings and faced the longest evacuation routes through narrow, easily blocked stairwells. The reconstruction patterns that followed major structural disasters revealed how thoroughly Roman society had institutionalized deadly construction practices. Rather than learning from failures and implementing safer design standards, property developers typically rebuilt on the same sites using the same dangerous methods that had caused previous collapses. The archaeological evidence shows multiple layers of collapsed buildings, with new structures erected directly on the debris of their predecessors. Strabo's observation about the unceasingly necessary reconstruction in Rome due to collapses and fires and repeated sales revealed the economic logic that sustained this cycle of destruction. Property owners found it more profitable to accept regular building losses than to invest in safer construction that would reduce rental yields. The externalization of risk onto tenants, who bore the consequences of structural failures while owners retained the profits, created market incentives that guaranteed continued disasters. The regulatory responses to structural disasters focused on symptoms rather than causes, treating height restrictions as solutions to fundamental problems of construction quality and engineering competence. Augustus's 70-foot height limit acknowledged that extremely tall buildings were inherently dangerous, but this regulation did nothing to address the substandard materials, inadequate foundations, and poor construction techniques that made even moderately tall buildings deadly. Buildings constructed before these regulations remained in use for decades, becoming progressively more unstable with age. The technological capabilities that pre-Rome demonstrated in other construction projects proved that safe building techniques were available but not applied to residential construction. The Pantheon, Colosseum, and various aqueduct systems remained stable after 2 millennia, demonstrating that Roman engineers possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to create durable structures. The deadly flaws in insulae construction reflected economic and political choices rather than technical limitations. The social acceptance of structural disasters as normal aspects of urban life revealed fundamental attitudes toward human life that prioritized economic efficiency over safety. Cicero's casual mention of his collapsing properties, Juvenile's satirical descriptions of residents sleeping under roofs ready to collapse, and Strabo's matter-of-fact observations about continuous reconstruction all suggest that Roman society viewed preventable deaths as acceptable costs of urban development. The demographic consequences of systematic structural failures shaped Roman urban populations in ways that functioned as mechanisms of social control. The differential mortality from building collapses, which disproportionately killed poor residents while sparing wealthy property owners, created urban environments where architectural hazards maintained class hierarchies through selective elimination of vulnerable populations. The long-term urban development patterns that emerged from cycles of collapse and reconstruction created Roman cities that were essentially machines for converting human lives into property values. Each building collapse eliminated excess population while creating opportunities for profitable reconstruction, generating wealth for property developers and construction contractors while reducing competition for housing among survivors. The international dimensions of Roman structural hazards reflected the empire-wide adoption of construction methods that prioritized speed and cost over safety. Roman architectural techniques, urban planning approaches, and construction technologies were exported throughout the Mediterranean world, creating networks of dangerous cities that experienced similar patterns of structural failure. The standardization of deadly practices across the empire meant that architectural disasters weren't isolated local problems, but systematic failures that affected millions of residents. The environmental factors that accelerated structural deterioration created predictable cycles of disaster that Romans learned to anticipate but never successfully prevented. Seasonal weather patterns, winter rains that saturated weak mortar, spring thaws that caused foundation movement, summer heat that created thermal stress interacted with inherent construction defects to create failure cascades that claimed lives throughout the year. The medical and humanitarian consequences of large-scale structural collapses exceeded the response capabilities of ancient urban systems. Multiple casualty incidents from building failures overwhelmed available medical resources, creating situations where treatable injuries became fatal due to lack of adequate care. The sudden nature of collapses meant that rescue operations were typically recovery missions rather than life-saving interventions, as most victims were either killed immediately or trapped beyond the reach of ancient rescue technologies. The psychological and cultural adaptations that allowed Roman society to function despite constant threat of structural disaster created attitudes toward risk and mortality that influenced Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The normalization of preventable death through architectural failure contributed to fatalistic worldviews that accepted massive casualties as inevitable consequences of urban life, rather than as symptoms of systemic failures in engineering and social organization. The legacy of Roman approaches to urban construction continues to influence contemporary debates about building safety, urban planning, and the acceptable costs of affordable housing. Modern cities still struggle with tensions between economic efficiency and structural safety, though contemporary engineering capabilities and regulatory frameworks generally prevent disasters on the scale of Roman insulae collapses. However, recent building failures in developing countries often reflect similar patterns of cost-cutting and regulatory failure that characterized Roman construction practices. As the final seconds tick away before your 7-story insulae transforms from shelter into avalanche, you become part of a historical continuum that connects ancient Rome to contemporary urban development. Challenges around the world. The collapse that is about to claim your life represents not just individual tragedy, but systematic failure of social institutions that chose to treat human safety as externalized cost rather than fundamental requirement of civilized society. The question that haunts Roman urban history and continues to challenge modern cities is whether structural disasters represent unavoidable consequences of housing large populations in limited space, or whether they reflect deliberate choices to prioritize property values over human lives. The Roman experiment in mass urban housing provided definitive answers through the bodies of thousands of residents who paid the ultimate price for their society's architectural ambitions. The weight of slumber in ancient Rome carried burdens far heavier than tired bodies seeking rest to bore the accumulated compromises of an entire civilization that chose to build its cities on foundations of acceptable risk, where the mathematical certainty of structural failure was balanced against the economic benefits of continued construction. The beds that collapsed, the buildings that crumbled, and the lives that ended in moments of catastrophic failure all testified to fundamental choices about whose lives mattered and what prices were acceptable to pay for urban progress. As you close your eyes tonight in whatever bed you call your own, you might pause to consider the invisible infrastructure of safety that surrounds your sleep. Building codes tested by centuries of disasters, materials engineered for reliability, emergency services trained for rapid response. These protections didn't emerge automatically from human progress, but were built on the accumulated experiences of civilizations like Rome, where millions of people paid with their lives to teach us the true costs of choosing economic efficiency over human safety. The Romans who crawled into their rope-strung beds, lit their oil lamps, tended their braziers, and listened to the creaking of their insulae walls were not so different from us in their basic needs for rest, warmth, light, and shelter. The dangers that made their sleep a daily confrontation with mortality arose not from their ignorance or technological limitations, but from systematic choices about whose lives were worth protecting and what risks were acceptable to impose on others in pursuit of profit and urban development. The legacy of Roman beds reminds us that the most mundane aspects of daily life, where we sleep, how we light our homes, what materials surround us in our most vulnerable moments, reflect the deepest values and priorities of our societies. Every design choice, every construction standard, every safety regulation represents decisions about human worth that echo through centuries, shaping the experiences of countless individuals who never participate in making those choices, but live and die with their consequences.